Welcome to the training webinar. I'm Dale Franks. We're starting for the second time. For those of you on YouTube, you don't know that, but there was a little bit of technical confusion on my part. But welcome to the webinar. Great to have you. And we're going to start off we'll see whether it's a 3 or 4-part series when we're done. It's called Advanced Design Concepts. I do this about once every 14 months or so. And it's kind of the accumulation or the cumulative webinar series for everything else we talk about through the year. This is basically a best practices webinar. There are a lot of best practices. And so we just have this series of just starting from scratch and building an application and going through all of the best practices that you need to follow when you build an application. Now, we talk about a lot of this stuff throughout the year in the other training webinars, and I'll sort of mention here and there, this is a best practice, do this as a best practice. But that's all very diffuse and it's spread off across, I think at this point I have like 56 or 58 different webinar topics. And so it's difficult to sort of compile all of those different webinars into one in your mind. So for the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to go through just building a mildly complex application from scratch, going through all of the best practices that you need to follow as you build an application. So we're kind of compressing all of our best practices into a single series here, while at the same time building the application that we're applying all of these best practices to. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next 3 or 4 weeks. So stick with me, and by the time we're done, you'll have a better idea of all of the best practices that you should implement when you're building an application. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing now, and we can begin building. To build a new application, the easiest way of doing it is ensuring that you have an application stub inside your template library. So I have a blank folder here, and I'm just going to go to Create New and Start from Template. Now, I have a whole webinar on creating a template stub, but my template stub is basically just called Application. So we're going to go with the ADC application. So we'll call it the ADC webinar application, I guess. And application is my generic basic template for a new application, as it says in the description. So I'm just going to go ahead and click. It's going to give me my confirmation. Are you sure you want to go ahead and proceed with this? I do. And so we'll just hit OK, and we'll see the loading screen. And what it's doing is it's building our application. So in my Advanced Design Concepts folder, it's going to build a folder called ADC Webinar. That's what I named the application. And it's going to give me my form and my process timeline and my email template. They're all pre-built. They're all stuck together through all of the proper associations. So all of the initial form creation and timeline creation and all the other things that I need to do are all built into my application stub. So the best practice actually is to do something that we're not actually going to do today, which is to build an application stub inside your template library. So just as a quick explanation of how the template library works, you have this folder, or you should have this folder. You may not. If you don't, you can just create it, or we have a set of pre-existing templates that we've created that are very generic that you can download from the support website, and you can install the template library and the template data folder from that application. But if you don't have a template library and you're not particularly interested in having our templates, you can just create a folder called template library. It should be at the root of the partition, and it should, of course, have the square brackets around the name. And if you download the one that we provide for you on the support website, you'll get all of these applications, including this one, which I think I created during the last webinar, which I'm just going to go ahead and delete real quick for now, because I actually have a template stub already built. I call it application. And just as a quick run through, what you need to do is build your basic form, timeline, and email template. I have a couple of other folders here because you often have business rules. You often have knowledge views. So I've just built a blank folder to store them so that the new application that I build already has them as part of its organizational structure. But the important part is to have your form, your timeline, and your email template already built. Now, the nice thing about this is that especially if you want to enforce a standardized look and feel across all of your forms on your platform, which you should, the best practice is to build a template that just has blank objects. Now, we'll take a quick look at each one of these, although we'll also see them later on as we begin building. But my email template is super basic. I've got a system variable for whoever the email user is. So you've been assigned a task. Click here to view it, and that's a hot link control that goes straight to the email URL, which is the URL for the task completion for the task that gets assigned to the user. It's got a system variable for the instructions, the task instructions that you put on your timeline activities. And then it has its email data control. That's all it does. So it's basically just one line of text with a link and then the instructions. And then I've got a very generic subject. Obviously, all of this may need to be changed in your application. You certainly may want to change this content and its wording, and you may want to customize the subject and other elements of the email template, but it gives you all of the basic items that an email template should have. It specifies who the user is, it provides a link to the task, and it shows them the task instructions. So the form similarly has just all of the basic items that we need on a form. Now, in my case, I have a logo and I've got the form title up here and I've got my section to display the running activity and instructions. And I've got the 3 controls that we have on every form that we build at BP Logix. And then I've just got an empty section control, my button area, and my forms routing slip. All of that already done. So I don't have to repeat this basic configuration every time I create a form. This saves me a lot of time. Similarly, if we go into the timeline itself, there's not much to the timeline. It has a basic approval loop already written into it. The approval steps are not named. Obviously, you may need to add additional approval steps. You may need to add a whole bunch of stuff to it, but it's just a basic process timeline. Both my form and my timeline are linked. So my form for timeline property is set in the timeline, as is the default email template, which points to this email template over here. And I do the same thing on the form. In the options section, it automatically starts the timeline whenever the form begins, and it associates the form with the timeline. So any sort of timeline-based conditions that I want to put into this form, it knows what timeline definition to use. Note the names are just called email template, form, and timeline. When you create your application, those are all going to be renamed. So I called this application ADC Webinar. So I now have an ADC Webinar email template, ADC Webinar form, and ADC Webinar timeline. So if you just give your objects in your template library very, very, very generic names, just call them email template, form, and timeline, then the name of your application will just automatically get appended, or I suppose prepended to them whenever your objects are created. And of course, because my form and my timeline and my email template are all properly linked together, I don't have to worry about doing any of that configuration, and I don't have to do any of the initial configuration on the form, which you have to repeat sort of every time you you build a form in a process timeline. So this saves me, at a minimum 15-20 minutes just at the start. There are some other basic best practices that are tied into this in the way that I've created the form and the process timeline and the email template. Uh, let's take a look at them again. We've already seen the email template, but just to repeat, to make it explicit, on an email template, you really do need three things as a minimum. It's nice if you personalize the email template. That's not necessary, but it is a good practice because it does make the email seem a bit friendlier by personalizing it some. So personalization on an email template is always a best practice. But the most important things here are A, the link that you need on the email template to click so that it opens the initial form or the request form, whatever it is. It opens it up in task context. So basically, this link using the email URL system variable it's basically like opening up the form from a task list. It opens it up in task context so that the user can complete whatever task has been assigned to them. So it is a special URL. It gets constructed on the fly that lets Process Director know that I am opening this form to complete a task. Sometimes you'll notice when you open a form, even if you have a task assigned, right? So let's say you have a task assigned and you open up a form just from a knowledge view. Unless that knowledge view is specifically configured to open that form in task context. Even though you have a task assigned, if you open that form, what you'll see at the bottom of the form are not any task completion buttons. You'll just see OK and cancel buttons. You have opened the form, but you have not opened it in task context. So you can't actually complete the task that's been assigned to you when you open the form in that way. So in the email template, using the email URL constructs a URL that does in fact open the form in task context. You will see your task completion buttons, and you can go ahead and immediately complete your task after opening it from the email notification. We'll talk about the instruction text more whenever we look at the process timeline. But you do need, as a best practice, to provide task instructions for every user activity. You don't have to fill out task instructions for everything, but for user activities, you really do, so that you give the user some indication of what it is that they're supposed to do. And finally, the third important thing on an email template is the email data control, which is what enables you to do a couple of things. It enables you to customize the subject. And as you can see in this subject, we're actually using the request number field as a form field system variable in the subject so that it includes the request number in the subject of the email. You also have the ability to return replies to a specific email address. Usually you don't do this. In your installation settings, you actually have a default notification email address. So if you don't fill out your from email, then it doesn't matter. You've already got one set in installation settings. It's the standard default from email that gets set. And that's the from address that gets used for every email that gets sent. But you can override that. You have to be careful about this. It's not usually done, but you can provide, if you fill out an email address in the from email, or you can separate the email addresses with commas or semicolons, and you can have multiple email addresses as the from. Well, actually, no, you can't. You can only have one email address as the from email. You can have multiple email addresses as the CC and BCC, but The from email is a single address because you can't have an email from multiple people. So you can put an email address in here and it will, on the email template, whenever the email gets sent, it will use this as the from address instead of the default one. But you do need to be careful about this because that means if someone replies to that email, it's going to go to whatever person you put in the from email here. You've also got from display. So the from email accepts the email address. The from display accepts just a plain text name. And this will be the display name that gets shown as the from address in the email. So you can do this, but you got to remember, if anybody replies, then it's going to go to a person. Usually your default email address doesn't really go to anyone, and usually you don't really reply to these email notifications. So if you have a circumstance where you want people to reply and you want a real person to see that reply, that's when you would use this. But be sure that the person who is going to receive any replies knows that they may receive replies from email notifications because people may have questions. So in cases where you need it, it's a great option to have, but most of the time you don't use it. Most of the time people understand that the email notifications don't receive a response. They're coming from an unattended mailbox and you just use the default. You also have the ability to put in CCs or blind CCs in an email if you want, and these will accept a comma separated list of email addresses. But that's the basic minimum that you have to have for an effective email notification. On the form itself, there are some best practices that are implemented in my template application and should be implemented in yours as well. Number one are these two conditions up here at the top. When should the form be editable? And when should the form be marked as read only so it can never be edited again? So the very first practice is this drop down. And the default is form fields are enabled by default, which means that everything on the form is enabled. So all of your form fields are enabled. That's the default state. It's probably not the best default state. Our recommendation is that you have it set to form fields are enabled only when, and set the condition for that to new form instance equals yes. The reason for this is that in many cases, whenever you receive a request, you want to ensure that you preserve the request as it was originally submitted. And so your default should be, okay, when the form first opens as a new form instance, I want the submitter to be able to edit everything that they see. And once they've done that and they click the submit button, I now no longer want anybody to edit that form, or certainly not the original request. Now, this does not mean that the form cannot be editable at any point in the process. Forms are constructed in a hierarchical fashion. Every object on a form, except for a control, an individual control like a text box or a drop-down. Well, even a drop-down is a container of a sort. But your layout controls on a form exist in a hierarchy. So at the top level of the hierarchy, you have the form object. And that's what we are editing here. We're editing the properties of the form object itself, the form container. And the form, of course, is a container for a bunch of layout controls and a bunch of data entry controls. So down one level from the form in the hierarchy of containers are the section controls. So we have two types of section controls. We have the embedded section and the regular section control. The embedded section doesn't display in the UI with any sort of special formatting or anything. It's just a layout control, and it just allows you to mark a section of the form as a section. and anything inside that embedded section you can show or hide or enable or disable by enabling or disabling or showing or hiding the section control itself. But there's no physical representation on the form of the embedded section control. The regular section control, of course, does have a visual representation. First of all, it has a boundary box all the way around it. It has a header that you can place text into. You can expand and collapse section controls on a form. They have a visual and physical manifestation on the page. And of course, inside each of the section controls is where your individual form controls are. So whenever you set a form field to be enabled, there can be a conflict between the different levels of the form when you enable or disable something. And the general rule is the control at the lowest level wins if there's a conflict. So what that allows you to do is to say, okay, I only want the form to be editable whenever I first create the form. And after that, I don't want the form to be editable. I want all of my fields to be disabled. And that's fine. But obviously, at some point in the process, you may want the people who approve a request to be able to make comments or to be able to fill out fields of their own. Well, then great. You can enable those fields or enable the section in which those fields are contained, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And if the section is enabled, but the form says I want all the form fields disabled, well, the section is a step lower than the form in the hierarchy of layout containers. And so the lowest level wins. So the form can be disabled, but if you say, I want this section to be enabled, then that section and the controls it contains will in fact be enabled, even though all the rest of the form is disabled. So what that enables you to do is to start off with the default of, I want the form enabled when it's a new form instance. Once it's submitted, I want everything disabled. And from that point on, as I go through the process, that allows you to determine when and where different fields on that form can be enabled and who can enable them perhaps, and when they become disabled again as you go through the process. So it gives you much finer control over when and where people can fill out things on the form. So as we build this form, what we'll be doing is for the approval sections, we'll be enabling the approval section during the approval process, but we're going to keep the rest of the form all disabled so that you can't just randomly enable the form. Now, we are going to give some users the ability to edit the form. And so we are going to have to give them some mechanism to setting the form to be enabled so that they can enable the entire form. And we'll go through that later as we build the form. But that's why we set this to form fields are enabled only when, and we just set it to new form instance equals yes. And then we'll just assume by default that everything on the form is disabled once it's submitted. And then we can pick and choose what we want to enable as we move through the process for people to edit as needed as part of our approval process. The other property is the entire form is read-only. Now, this has nothing to do with the controls, nothing to do with whether a control is enabled or disabled. This is solely to make the form, to place the form in a non-savable state. So many times when you have a form and it's completed, it's traveled through the approval process, and so you end up with all of these completed requests. You might have a knowledge view that just displays, all of the repeated requests, or it may display like for a particular user. You may have a knowledge view that says my completed requests, and it will display all of the form instances for those requests, and the user can, open that request. Okay, good as far as that goes, but if the form is not set to read only, they're generally going to see an OK and a cancel button on that form instance. you think, okay, so big deal. They can't complete they can't complete a task. So why do I care if they see those buttons? Well, you really care if they see the OK button, because the OK button is always a submit button. And so if I go into an existing form instance, one that's already been completed, and I open up that form, if any of those fields are enabled, I can change them. And B, clicking the OK button is actually a save this form button. Submit buttons are always save this form. So if I can edit the form, and I do, and then I click the OK button, that form is going to get saved with the changes that I made. Now, hopefully, if the form fields are disabled, there's nothing I can change. But if I get somehow the ability to see that form in an enabled state, or something else has happened that has put that form in an enabled state, well, it's going to save if I hit the OK button. I want to prevent that. So this is kind of a belt and suspenders kind of thing, but what it basically says is once this form and the condition is timeline status equals complete. So once this timeline is complete, I want to put this form instance into a non-editable state, a read-only state. Again, this only affects whether the form can be saved. Has no effect as to whether controls are enabled or disabled, visible or invisible. It just prevents the form from saving. So it's always a good idea to set both of these to ensure, A, while the process is running, we don't have people who are inadvertently editing parts of the form that we don't want them to edit. And I say inadvertent because I'm charitable, but we also don't want to have intentional edits of that in most cases. And I don't want it edited once my approval is done. And so I want to lock this form down so that it can only be edited whenever I say it needs to be edited. Obviously, there's a timeline, so we do need to set the automatically start this process. That one's kind of obvious. You have to set it or your process won't kick off. But we often forget about the timelines associated with form property. That's an important one too, because there are many times whenever you are creating a form where you need to create conditions based on the process timeline. So for example, we are going to have some conditions on the form that are going to check to see what our current running activity is. It's going to make my life easier if I just say, well, I'm going to associate this timeline with the form, because this timeline now becomes the default timeline in the condition builder whenever I begin creating conditions and I want to make any conditions that are timeline-based conditions, because it's going to just assume automatically, oh, you want to use, in this case, the ADC webinar timeline. So it saves me a little bit of configuration time simply by setting the timeline in the timelines associated with form. Now, setting this does one and one thing only. When I submit the form, it will kick off this timeline. That's all that property does. So you really do need to set the timelines associated with property in order to ensure that your conditions are just easier to fix. This is one of those best practices that makes your life easier and makes configuration easier and faster for you. If you don't have this set, then every time you make a reference to the process timeline, you're going to have to choose the process timeline before you can choose any of the attributes like the running activity name or whatever. There is a question up top. Why does it say optional next to the timeline workflows associated with form when in fact it is required, especially now since workflows have been deprecated? Okay, so I understand your first question. Why does it say optional next to the timeline workflows associated with form property when in fact it is required? It is not required. You don't have to fill in this property. It is a best practice to do so, but it's not required. You don't have to do it. If I did not associate a timeline with this form, I could still create timeline-based conditions. It just gets more tedious to do because now it doesn't know what timeline I want to use. So I always have to go through. And if you have as many timelines on your system as I have on mine, which is to say hundreds, I've now got a drop down that I've got to search through, and I've got to find the right timeline, and I select it. And only after I select it will it show me all of the other timeline attributes that I actually need to fill out the timeline. So it makes my life easier. Is it required? Nope. That's why it says optional. It's not required. Now, as far as this goes, workflows associated with form. Okay, we're in a slightly perilous position. So yes, are workflows deprecated? Yes, they are. Do we have customers who are still trying to use workflows? Yes, we do. Do we have customers who have been with us for like 10 or 12 years who have a whole big backlog of things that they built in workflow, even though we begged them with tears in our eyes not to use workflow? Yes, we do. So yes, workflows are deprecated. And yes, on April 1st, 2026, if you have any questions about workflows or you try to submit a tech support ticket about workflow objects, we're not going to help you because it's going to go end of support. End of life is a more difficult topic because we have customers who still have workflows on their system. If we strip those workflows out of the product completely, then that's going to blow up a lot of their existing processes. So we don't want to do that. So there are things that we have done. So in the the create new menu, I guess I can just go there because I'm not actually making any changes here. So in your create new menu, you see that where it still says workflow definition. In 6.1.400, it won't. We're taking it out. So you will, whenever we release .400, you won't be able to create any new workflow definitions. So we're going to stop the creation of new workflow definitions. Are we going to strip all the workflow functionality out of the product and make all of the workflows, especially all the legacy workflows that our customers have, we're going to make them non-functional? No, we're not. Eventually, workflows are going to disappear from Process Director, and we're going to remove all of those references. For now, we're just saying you're going into support on the 1st of April, 2026. So if you have questions about workflows or you have any sort of technical issues with your workflows, we're not going to help you with those anymore. We've been yelling and screaming for a decade now that workflows have been deprecated. It's in big purple banners on every page of workflows in our documentation. Like I said, we're begging you with tears in our eyes not to use workflows because workflows have been deprecated since version 3 of the product. But there have been people who have been using them, who started off years ago using workflows and who have never or have only recently transitioned. So they're going to be here for a while. And while we are going to prevent you from creating new workflows anymore, so you just won't be able to create any of them, they still exist. And you may still need, if you have legacy workflows, you may still need this property there. So we're not stripping it out. We're not going to blow anything up just because we are getting rid of workflows finally after, well, you know what else is going end of life on April 1st, 2026? Word-based forms. Word-based forms have been dead as fried chicken basically since 2018, probably at the latest, the last version of Word that would even support the ActiveX control that you need or the ActiveX plugin that you need for Word to actually build Word-based forms was Word 2016. Microsoft just killed ActiveX and they killed Internet Explorer. And of course, Internet Explorer itself went end of life in 2022. So it's been, realistically, it's been 7 years since workflow or since word-based forms are even viable. And it's been 3 years since ActiveX and Internet Explorer went completely end of life for Microsoft. So for the last 3 years, there's been no support for that at all from Microsoft, the people who created the technology. So nobody's even been able to build word-based forms as far as I know for at least 3 or 4 years. So we're finally 3 years later getting rid of word-based forms too. So we're being as flexible, I think, as we can be. Okay, so I hope that answered your question, even though it was a very long answer. The next property, and I always get pushback on this. In fact, I get pushback from one specific person. However, we have a fundamental disagreement. If you have disabled fields on your form, as a best practice, you should show them as text. Now, there are both technical and practical reasons for this. First of all, if you don't have this turned on, the show disabled fields as text, what's going to happen when your form runs? And so let's go ahead and update and run it. And I've turned that property off. Now, what we'll see at the top of the form when it finally consents to show us itself will be my top 3 fields with the submitter submission date and the request number. Now, those fields are all disabled, and they're all disabled for reasons that I'll explain in a few minutes whenever we get to the best practices for that. But those fields are all going to be disabled. Now, with this property, can I show both? No, I don't. I guess I can make this a little smaller. So the thing with the show disabled fields as text property is that if it's turned off, and when my form finally shows up here as it does, it's showing you the representation of the controls. And by the way, you can click into them. And note when I click into them, they get highlighted. These are real controls. And they are being presented as controls. However, they're being presented as disabled controls. There's a couple of problems with this. First of all, if I have a bunch of controls on my form that are all disabled, even though they're disabled and I can't edit them, they're still having to be presented as controls. And so each of these controls have additional overhead that is associated with them in terms of how they work and how they displayed and whether they show up in tab order and all of that, because they're controls. And so controls add weight to the form. But if I can't edit them, why am I showing them as controls? So there's, first of all, a design question. Is this great design to show you a bunch of controls and then taunt you with the idea that these are controls, but I'm not letting you do anything with them? Number 2, I'm not happy with the way, and I've never been happy with it, but now that accessibility is so much more of a consideration, I am not happy with the way we decided, and by we, and apparently something very threatening is in my front yard, but by whenever we created form controls and we decided we were going to have to show disabled controls, and we decided we were going to show them as grayed out. Nobody was thinking about accessibility, but the fact is you've basically got a gray background with slightly darker gray text. And for people with visual or acuity issues, that's not easy to read. So it's not really accessibility compliant. And it has technical overhead, and it's also bad design. So that's 3 reasons. I don't think I need to keep giving you reasons to justify why you should click show disabled fields as text. Because if you do that and we refresh our form, I probably should have saved this before we refreshed our form, since just clicking the checkbox doesn't actually save the property. So let's see, did that save? It looks like it. Let's refresh. Now, with that checkbox checked, oops, clicked out of it. With that checkbox checked, now all I'm doing is just printing text to the page. So now there are no longer any controls. So the overhead with those controls is gone. I'm no longer taunting people by showing them grayed out controls that are, oh, by the way, also hard to read and may not be fully compliant with accessibility standards, because back in 1996, we decided that disabled controls would all be gray, and so that no one could read them. This is a better solution. It eliminates the overhead of form controls. Now, that's not saying the form controls don't exist. They still do. And if we, have to refresh the form or a form event fires, we are going to do a server round trip to update whatever we need to on the server. But whenever the page gets delivered to the end user, we're delivering a more lightweight page. And if you have a couple of hundred form controls on the page, which, please don't do that, but if you do, it's going to be a lot more lightweight on the user end if I don't have to worry about form controls, if I just need to deliver them as text to the end user. So there are a lot of benefits for setting that show disabled fields as text. Wow, it's already 10:42 and I haven't even started building anything. I was going to go to these properties sort of as we built the objects, but since I've got all three built and they pre-exist, and I'm afraid I'm going to forget stuff, we're going to go through all the best practices here up front. So we may not be able to begin actually building our form until next week, but we'll go as far as we can this week until we run out of time. So with that change up in how we're going to address all of these best practices, let's switch over to the form or the process timeline and cover the basic best practices there. You should always have the form for timeline and default email template for timeline properties set. Going to make your life a lot easier. Now, most of the time, whenever you are creating an application, the timeline part of the application is going to start when the form is submitted. So you really do have to use start this process when the form is submitted property on the form. You really do need to have that set. And if that's how you start the process, then fine. The form instance that gets submitted will automatically be attached to the process timeline instance that gets started once the form submission is accepted. And so there's already a form instance associated with the process timeline. So technically, in that case, I don't really have to fill this property out, but you should, because what the form for timeline property does is it sort of combines the two corresponding properties on the form into a single property here, where A, it knows what timeline instance is supposed to be with the form. B, I can kick off a process automatically from like a goal or from a knowledge view to run a process on each row in a knowledge view. And when it kicks off that process, it will automatically attach a copy or an instance of the ADC webinar form, in this case, to the process timeline. Now, obviously, if I'm starting the timeline itself, that's exactly the opposite of the way timelines usually start, which is to say, usually a user opens the form, fills it out, and submits it. If I just kick off the process timeline, nothing has been submitted. So I've got a blank form. And if you're going to do that, then you obviously have to figure out a way to get that initial information included onto that form, the information that the user would normally put into the form before they submit it. The other thing it does is it provides the association. So in the form, and in this form, we are uh, certainly going to have to do this. We're going to have to use some form data to determine what activities we are going to run when the timeline runs. And based on what we're going to build is a multi-request form. So I can have different types of requests. And based on the request type, I may run some process timeline activities and I may skip others for certain types of requests. So, for example, I think on the review request that we are going to build, I don't want the immediate supervisor to actually see that protest that is being filed by the user who sees that they got some sort of rating on their annual review and they've decided to contest that rating. Well, we're going to skip the supervisor who presumably provided that rating, and we're just going to go straight to the department head and have them go through the process of reviewing that rating and ultimately going to HR. But we're going to skip the supervisor step. So I'm going to have conditions that are based on the form, and this association tells it what form I'm going to use. And so it automatically knows what form fields are available on that form and what the other form attributes are. So again, it makes my life easier as a developer by creating that association on form for timeline. Even if I have a timeline like this that I'm going to presume will always be started by a form submission, I'm still going to set this property because it provides the association and makes creating conditions a lot easier because it just automatically defaults to this form as the form that I want. Now, if I don't set this, just like not setting its corresponding property in the form, if I don't set this, I can still have form conditions. It's just that every time I create a condition, I'm going to have to select the form definition that I want to use for that condition before it will allow me to select any of the attributes. And again, if you've got a lot of forms on your system, even though it's only one drop down, it's still tedious. And in my case, it's super tedious because I probably have 100 form definitions on here that are named test form. And so in that instance, for me, this is really mandatory so that I don't have to go hunting through all of the 500 forms named test form to figure out which one actually has the form fields I want. Similarly, the default email template for this timeline, again, this is a make my life easier deal, because if I have a default email template, and when we go to the email template, we're going to talk about multi-message email templates, which is the best practice for that. But we're not going to talk about that here. If I have a multi-message template that basically has all of my possible notifications in a single email template, then when I set this property, I never have to worry about the email template again. It's just done. This is the default email template. Anytime a notification goes out, whether it's a task assignment notification or some other courtesy notification that I've decided to send to someone else, I don't care because I know that I've got the appropriate message somewhere in my template that will show the end user whatever it is that they're supposed to see. So I never have to configure all of my timeline activities. Now, I do see people do this a lot. They'll go to a timeline activity, and this in this case is a user activity, and we'll go to the notifications tab, and it says notify participants when activity starts. So usually I don't have to do anything here. And certainly if I have a default email template applied up here in the options section, it's going to use the email template that's the default for this timeline. And I see people going in and going to every single activity and trying to select the email template that they want to use for the process timeline. This is completely unnecessary. That's why you do this in the first place, so that you have an email template that does exactly what you want it to do, and you don't have to worry about configuring the notifications tab for every single process timeline activity to show them the notification that you want. So again, this is a make your life easier thing. So it is a best practice. This just reminded me of something that I didn't show you on the form. So we're going to come back here, but I got to backtrack for a second. I apologize. I just skipped right past it. The instantiated form name. The instantiated form name and the associated property that just reminded me of it, the instantiated name for the timeline definition. Probably less important for the timeline definition, but very important for the form, is that this enables you to create a customized name for each instance that gets created whenever the form is submitted. And so if we go back and look at the form, I have request number, and there's a system variable for the request number field. Now, the request number, as we're about to discuss, is generated from in my case, a sequence number that is specifically customized. And because it's a sequence number, that means that every request that gets generated is going to have its own unique human readable ID number as the request number. And then I've got the submitter field as a system variable here, so I know who submitted it. And then I've got submission date, so I know when the form was submitted. So this gives me three pieces of, well, one of them is definitely unique, and two pieces of semi-unique data that, if I'm looking in a knowledge view, gives me a lot of options for finding different requests. Because if I search by request number, I know I'm only going to get back a single specific record that matches my request number. But I can also search by submitter and see all of the requests by a single submitter. Or I can search by submission date and see everybody who submitted a request on a specific date, or perhaps a date range. So by giving each instance a unique name, especially on the form, because for end users, most of the time, almost all of the time, you are returning form instances in your knowledge views. So you want your form instance names to be very obvious and very logical as to what they are, and to also have a unique value, which is why we have that request number, so that users can find specific requests very quickly, because the sequence number or the request number is unique. Now, I have a corresponding property on the process timeline, which is the instantiated name property. We have a default that is actually, from an administrative point of view, I think pretty useful, because it shows me the name of the timeline definition, so ADC webinar timeline. And it's also going to show me all of the timeline attachments. So that means in the name of the timeline instance, it's going to give me the timeline definition name. Then it's going to give me the form instance name, which has those unique values. So that is cool. And it's also going to give me the names of any document attachments, because, as we'll discuss when we talk about attachments, we always want to attach documents to the process, so that both the documents and the form, which are all process attachments, can all be accessed from the timeline instance. So I have access to everything simply by opening the timeline instance. And if I have document attachments, their names will appear in the name as well. Now, does this make the names long? Yes, it does. But it also gives you a lot of information, including the request number, that makes it easier to search on administrative knowledge views. Most of the time, you don't show timeline instances to end users. You show them forms. conversely, whenever you're talking about implementers or system administrators, you often want to show them timeline instances because that's where they're going to need to go to do any sort of troubleshooting in case something goes off the rails in a process, it goes into an error state or whatever. So you're going to want to give them names that are useful as well. Now, as it happens, I do like the the default name that we give it whenever you create a process timeline instance. And this is, in fact, the default name. It's good for most purposes, but you should consider whether you want to give it a name similar to its form instance, especially if you're going to have a lot of attachments. If I'm going to have like 5 or 10 different document attachments, this timeline attachments system variable is going to return a lot of text. And so your names have a tendency to turn into paragraphs because I've got 30 Word documents that I've uploaded and I've converted them to PDF. So you might want to think about how the instantiated name is going to work in the instance of your process timeline. What time is it? Okay, it's 11 o'clock. Time is shooting by fast, though. So let's take a look at the default timeline itself. This is, I think, the default way of setting up a process timeline. There are several practices that are implemented here. We're going to go through them one at a time. And again, remember, we haven't even gotten to building anything yet. We're just looking at the default objects. But as soon as we get through this, we'll open the form and we'll start going into the form design part for as long as we can today, and then we'll pick it up again next week. So as I said, this should be basically the way your default process timeline works. I'm going to need a request number. Now, in my case, I am generating the request number from a sequence number. You may have some different method of setting up a request number, and that's perfectly fine. But generally, we set things up via a sequence number that we have to customize. And we're not going to get into sequence number customization and how to deal with the sequence number system variable, but I'm doing it as the very first activity in my process timeline. So as soon as my form gets submitted, the very first thing I do is I invoke the set form data custom task so that I can set the value of the request number field to whatever custom value I want. Now, in my case, all I've done is put in sequence number. So it's just going to give me a generic sequence number. So I'm probably going to be in the, who knows, 700 or 800 range. So my first request might be request 681 or something. Obviously, you can customize the heck out of sequence numbers to come up with the ones that the format that I usually use are like for HR would be like HR 25-0001. So you can do all kind of cool things with it, but I do it in the process for a very specific reason. I don't want to burn sequence numbers. There is no way, if I want to generate a sequence number in a form, it's going to have to generate it before the form is submitted. There's no way that I can say, only generate the sequence number on the form if I'm submitting the form. It just doesn't work that way. I don't have that granular of an access to when the set form data activity runs. So that means if I try to set a sequence number anywhere in the form and that form doesn't get submitted, then I'm going to burn that sequence number. Because if I try to do it on form close, it's going to burn that sequence number, even if I just click the X up in the upper right corner of the screen to close the form without submitting. Closing the form closes the form. And so it's going to burn that sequence number. It's going to generate it on form close, even though the form wasn't submitted. So I do it in the process timeline as the very first step in the process timeline. I just run the set form data custom task. And I run the custom task intentionally because I don't have to do it this way. After all, I've got a set form data tab on every timeline activity. I could just, here at the parent activity, I literally could just say, okay, well, when this activity starts, I want you to do a set form data. I don't do it that way intentionally because I want to show that my request number is being set. It accomplishes the same thing. If I just go to, or I could just go up here to the set form data section and just say, okay, well, we'll just set approval loop, and on task start of approval loop, I'll just add an action and we'll just set, request, wait a second, request number. There it is. And we'll just set request number to whatever we want to set it to. You can certainly do that, but it is not as obvious. It kind of gets hidden behind the scenes when you're using a set form data like that. And again, it's fine, I guess, but I just wouldn't do it that way. I will just invoke the custom task and take the extra overhead hit of just having the set form data custom task run. It's not that big of a hit, but it makes it a separate process timeline activity. So I am explicitly telling people if they come in to edit the process timeline, this is where I'm setting the request number. So we want to have a request number. Generally, if we want to generate it off of a sequence number system variable, then the best place to put that is in the process timeline, because the process timeline is only going to run if I have a valid form submission. So I'm only going to generate a request number if I have a valid form submission. So that means I'm never going to burn a request number, because all of my request numbers will always point to a valid form and timeline instance. So I have a valid application instance running every time I generate a request number. Second important thing to do on any sort of approval at all is to put them in a loop. So I have an approval loop here, and it contains these two activities, approval 1 and approval 2. They are child activities. You can tell because they were indented and because of their numbering system. Approval loop is activity 2, and approval 1 is activity 2.1, and approval 2 is 2.2. So this lets you know that these are child activities of the approval loop. Whenever we have an approval, we have to figure out how to do 3 things, and the loop is what enables us to do those 3 things. A, I need to be able to just go through the loop once, assuming everything works well, and I just need to be able to drop out of whatever activity runs after the end of my approvals. In this case, it's a notification. So I have to have my optimal path through my approval loop. Now, that's pretty easy. That's just done by creating the activities inside the loop. But I've also got 2 other things that I've got to figure out how to do in most cases. What happens if I need the initial user to resubmit their request? They need to edit something isn't clear, I need more information, I have a question, whatever it may be. I need to get it back to the submitter so that they can provide some sort of answer for me. And the third thing I need to do is, what happens if somebody just says no? If the department head said, yeah, this is not happening, we're not going to do this, and they deny my request. Okay, well, it's been denied by my department head. Do I need now to show it to HR? No. What I need to do is to end all of the approvals, because I've now got one canonical authority figure saying this isn't going to happen. So it's over. My request is done. All I need to do is just notify my user that, hey, we've looked at your request and it's dumb, and so we're not going to do it. And I would probably phrase it more tactfully than that, but I've got to be able to get that notification out. And I don't, and if I have, in this case, I only have 2 approval activities, right? We're going to need some more approval activities. So if I have, 10 approval activities and the second level of approval is my department manager, and my department manager says no, I don't need to send it up to the director or the vice president or finance or anybody else. That request has been denied, so I need to get out of the approval loop. Well, that's why building in an approval loop inside a looping structure is a best practice. So you should always use approval activities inside an approval loop so that I have a way to restart the loop at the very beginning so that the form submitter can resubmit the form and then restart the entire approval process. And I need to have a way of canceling the process and just exiting all of the approvals, which in this case would take us straight to my result notification telling me whether my request was approved or denied, as the case may be. So those are the 2 important things that you need to keep in mind when you're building process timelines, just in terms of best practices. Set your request number and make it an explicit process timeline activity. And also for all of your approval activities, stick them inside an approval loop, which means that you are in the approval loop itself going to have to set the conditions of when you're going to jump back to the top of the loop and when you're going to cancel the loop and just exit the loop entirely. So you're going to need, now, jumping back to the top of the loop is not as common. You don't need it for every single request. We're going to model it in this request just to sort of show you how to do it, but you don't need it. That's not important. You can live without that. But cancel the remainder of the loop. I mean, I guess you can live without it, but you really, really, really don't want to, because it just makes escaping the whole approval cycle whenever a person with the authority to deny it denies it. It makes your life a lot easier. It just makes it much easier to configure process timelines and to configure how they work. Prior to the existence of the looping ability and the parent activity, we had to use the branch activity and do a whole bunch of checking after each activity. Do I skip the next activity or do I run it? And it gets really tedious trying to build an approval loop where with every step in the approval loop, you have to check to see whether the last step hit approved or deny or cancel. You have to constantly make either, needed when conditions, or you have to constantly create branch activities. This is way easier just to put everything in a loop and then determine when to restart the loop and when to exit the loop. Loops also have, a variety of interesting things that you can do outside of the world of simply going through approval loops, but approval loops are by far the most common thing that you do. And so this is the easiest way of setting up an approval loop to just work the way that you want it to work by configuring 2 properties on one tab and one process timeline activity, and then everything just works the way that you want it to, so that you don't have to do anything special in your configuration on your subsequent activities other than to ensure that if you want to restart the loop, the name of whatever activity or the name of whatever result you're going to put on the activity contains the word resubmit or deny in order to reset your loop or to exit your loop. Other than that, you don't have to do a whole bunch of special considerations. So that makes your life a lot easier. Last thing, the result notification here. It's always a good idea, again, not mandatory, but always a good idea to send your submitter a result notification when the process is complete. So this kind of serves as their first notification that, hey, you can do the thing that you wanted to do, or we are done with the thing that we said we were going to do for your approval, whatever it may be. Just as a courtesy, it's nice for them to get a note that gives them what the final disposition was. They can save it, they can delete it, whatever, but it's always nice to give them that option at the end of the process. And because this option comes at the end of the approval process, it also illustrates one other thing that is important to remember, and that is how dependencies work whenever you're going to throw a parent activity. Parent activities start, and when parent activities start, they invoke their child activities immediately. So when this activity starts, the first thing it does is it invokes approval 1. Now, the approval loop is going to run until the last of its child activities is complete. So in my case, I only have 2 activities, approval 1 and approval 2. And approval 2 can't begin until approval 1 is complete. So these 2 activities are going to happen in sequence. As soon as approval 2 is done, then my approval loop activity ends as well. So whenever I have a loop and I'm starting to create dependencies, so in this case, I don't want result notification to run until all of my approvals are done. But note, I am not making it dependent on approval 2. Instead, I am making this activity dependent on the approval loop parent activity. So whenever you are using parent activities in a process timeline, make any dependent activities dependent on the parent activity, not on any of its child activities. That's a best practice. It's not always possible. There may be a case where I have an activity that is not part of my approval loop, but I want it to run after one of my approval loop activities have completed. In that case, but I may not want it as part of the loop itself. I may want it to run independently of the loop itself. And one of the things that makes process timelines so flexible and so delightful in one sense, and so utterly infuriating in another sense because of the level of complexity that you can apply, is that I may want to have this activity down here running as a dependent of approval 1. So it's perfectly valid if you need to do it that way. But the general best practice is to use the parent activity as part of your dependency chain. Do not use its child activities as part of the dependency chain unless there is a specific reason to do so, which I recognize is a hole big enough to drive a truck through, but that's the general best practice that you should consider. Okay, so we have gone through our first 3 objects, and we have looked at the sort of generic best practices on creating the objects. So now let's shift gears and let's go to the form, and let's start looking specifically at the form and its design. So there's nothing else we really need to worry about the properties of the form. We need to go run into the form itself. Now, again, I have a couple of best practices that are already thrown onto this form right from the beginning. First is this section up at the top. Now, I've done it as a section, and there are several different ways of doing this, but in general, it's a good idea to give your users 2 pieces of information. What activity is currently running? So by extension, it's important to name your activities with logical names that mean something to the end users so that they can tell what that activity means. So approval 1 and approval 2 are not going to cut it. When we go back and start configuring our process timeline, we'll deal with those. But you should tell the user the running activity. And of course, you need to give the user the instructions that assist them and tell them what it is that they're going to do. So we are going to have to skip back to the timeline briefly and look at one of these user activities. These are your instructions. The system variable for recalling it is task instructions. And anytime that you have a user activity, you should be filling out the instructions. Now, note, this is just the default that came out of my template application. So I don't have any instructions written here because I don't actually know what approval one is. And so depending on the approval activity, which I'm going to have to rename anyway, I may have different instructions, but you should always have instructions. And what that enables you to do by having those instructions is on the form, whenever you go into the design of the form, you can place those instructions on the form so that whenever this form kicks off, at the very top of this form, I'm going to have this nice bold red text up here that tells me as a user what activity is running and what I'm supposed to do to complete my task in that activity. Now, I don't want to show this all the time. Like, for example, I certainly don't want to show it to my end user when they first open the form. And so as you can see, when my form first opens, I do not, in fact, see any of that information. The way that I have done this is I've just put in explicit text here, which means it will always show. And so because I've done it that way, and there are arguments for doing it different ways, maybe we'll talk about those in a second, but because I've done it in this way, and I have explicit text here, thing to remember, if I am not in a running activity, I will have no running activity name to display. And if there is no running activity, I certainly am not going to have instructions to display either. So what this is going to show is literally the text running activity : -instructions : and that'll be all that you see on the form. Well, I obviously don't want to show that. So with this method of implementation, what I've had to do on my template is I've had to put it inside an embedded section. And my embedded section has this field hidden. So that entire embedded section is hidden whenever it's a new form instance, because in a new form instance, there are no activities, there are no instructions. So I need to hide it. Now I'm doing that because I have literal text here. I don't actually have to do it that way. I do have the ability to, on the activity running name, to just throw in a pre or post text to append or pre-pinned text. So I could put right here, I could do pre running activity. And I probably should put that in quotes. Pre running activity : space quote. So I can do that. And if I do it this way, then this activity, this timeline, or I'm sorry, this system variable will only display any of this text whenever I am running in an activity. And similar thing for instructions. I can also use the pre-formatter there. In fact, I can do pre-formatter. I can throw some HTML in this bad boy. If I want to boldface it as a, kind of a header, I can do that. And you may find that hard to read. So I should probably be showing you these changes over here in, let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. File, new text file. Let's go there. So that's what I wrote inside that system variable. So if I do this, then, it's actually going to show up on the form with, forgive the fact that I can't boldface this in a text editor, but it will just say running activity approval 1. And that's what it will say when I'm actually running in approval 1. And if it's a new form instance, then what it's going to show me is that, and it's not going to appear at all. So if I do it this way, then technically, um, figure out which is my alt tab and which is my not alt tab. So if I do it that way, then I don't have this plain text, and then I don't have to worry about these embedded section controls. So you got a couple of different ways to go with how to do this. I did it this way with the literal text, but you could actually use the pre and just get rid of that literal text, and then the values would only display whenever it was not a new form instance, and I wouldn't have to do this extra configuration by adding in these embedded section controls and setting conditions on the field is hidden when property and setting that to new form instance. If I just use the system variables itself, then, and I should probably erase this here, but if I just use the system variables itself, then the system variables simply will not display and they won't take up any space on the form. That's up to you. I think if I was going back and redoing this, I'd probably try it with the pre. Although I do like the greater degree of control it gives me to put in the literal text. So in this case, I am willing to make my life a little bit harder, but that's all up to you. Next thing to talk about, 3 things that we need on every form. Again, this is a best practice. It's not mandatory. You don't have to do this, but because honestly, the data is accessible elsewhere. It's just that when I'm building knowledge views, it makes my life slightly easier if I add these fields. Even though the form submit user is just part of the form itself. It's there. It's not a form field, but it's there. The form submit date, again, it's there. Not a form field, but I have access to it in a knowledge view, just slightly less convenient to grab. But if I have them as text on the form, then I can display them to the users. Or I can give the users the ability to submit on behalf of by perhaps making them editable. Gives me a lot of options just by default, having a submitter, which is a user picker control. So it just is set with a default value to default to form submit user. So whoever submits this form becomes the form submit user, and they are the submitter. So I save that as a form control. Same thing for submission date. I am going to set this again to the default value of form submit date. Now notice form submit date, form submit user, those are existing system variables. They exist. They'll get applied to this form automatically. I don't have to have form fields for them. It's just a good idea if I do, because then I can just use those form field values that I generally always have access to, and I can access them really quickly. And besides, like in the condition builder and the choose system variable dialog box, form field is often the default choice. And because it's the default choice, it's already showing me a drop-down with all the form fields. So all I have to do is click in and select submitter or select submission date. And that value just happens to be the form submit date. I'm just making it easier to be a little lazier without having to go and change it from form to field to go back to the menu and then pick form and then pick form submit date and then hit OK. All I have to do is just pop it open, pick the submitter form field, hit OK, and I'm done. It's slightly less inconvenient, and I am so lazy that it is worth having that slight level of inconvenience. The third field that we always have on every form that we build here is a request number field. All of your requests should have some unique identifier that enables you to uniquely pick out a single form instance if you're searching for it. And so a request number is the easiest and most logical way of doing that. Now, because I don't want to generate a request number until I have a running timeline instance that's valid, I can't generate the request number on the form, as I explained earlier. So I am going to set a default value for this field. I'm going to set it as a string, and I'm just going to give it the temporary request number of generated when submitted. If the form doesn't get submitted, who cares? If the form does get submitted, the very first thing the process timeline is going to do is change generated when submitted to HR 25 whatever, and it's going to reset that name. Or I think in this case, it's just going to set it to like number 750 or whatever. But in any event, that's a unique number that will get applied and it'll just get overwritten here. So my user, whenever they first, kick off the form, and the form runs for them the first time, what they'll see, and we saw it a little earlier whenever we were looking at the form, what they'll see under request number is just that, just the text generated when submitted. When I submit this, and why not submit it? Let's just give it a second to submit and change. There we go. Oh, well, my numbers aren't as high as I thought they were. So my current sequence number is now 613. And so now I have a unique request number that I can use in a knowledge view to find this specific request, which I am going to deny. And I thought I would get through one without having any email notifications that I have to clean up after the webinar. Okay, so this section up here at the top, this is a standard section. So I've got my branding and colors with my logo and my dark blue bar with the white text that says form title. I've got my notification line to tell end users what activity is running and what the instructions for that activity are. And I've got my 3 common fields. Now I can actually begin working on my request itself. So let's talk about some things we need to think about as best practices whenever we start building our form. First of all, there's a section control here. That is intentional. Remember, we talked about earlier about our form and how the form is a hierarchy of containers. I am going to want to put controls in general into section controls, especially for something like this, where what we're going to end up with is a request information section, which is only going to be editable during the form submission. And then I want to lock that down. So I've already set my form to make all those fields disabled. But I'm going to have another area where I'm going to want approvers to be able to make comments or add additional information, which we'll have to construct later. I'm going to want those in a section too, because again, to make my life easier for the data that I want approvers to be able to edit, I want to stick that in a section so I can just make that section enabled. So the rest of my form will be enabled, but that one section will be enabled, which will enable me to, as an approver, to add in the data that I need on that form to finish my approval task. So using sections or embedded sections is a best practice. And again, the only difference between sections and embedded sections is that the section control has a visual representation on a page. Now, what that visual representation means for a section control is that I can do a set form data. I can set my section to collapse or expand because sections have a value. They're not a data entry control, but they do have a value. And the value of expanded, well, actually the value is either 1 or 0. And if I have the value set to 1, it shows the section control expanded and exposes all the controls inside the section control. But if I have expanded set to 0, the section shows as compressed. Now, this gives me a lot of flexibility on the form to be able to change the design and to show and hide different parts of the form without actually disabling or hiding the controls because, well, I have no controls in there. So let's just put some placeholder text in here. So at least at least the section contains something. Now let's run her again. So even though it only says placeholder text and it's not going to be super impressive, the fact is I can show and hide that on the form without actually affecting any of the controls. So let us pretend that rather than placeholder text, there were like 15 controls here for various things. And I might not want to disable them, and I might want to make them editable if necessary, but by default, I might not want to show them. And so I can just set my section control to be collapsed. Everything inside that control is, still valid. It's still enabled. I can still fill it out. I'm just not showing it at the moment. And if my user does need to access it, they can go in and expand it and make whatever changes they want to it. What this allows me to do is to change the visual look of my form without affecting its functionality at all, to make a more compact display on the form. Because there might be other controls on this form that I do need to fill out at this moment. But the information here, I only need to fill out if it's absolutely necessary or if I need to make a change. So section controls, visual section controls, give me a lot of flexibility in how I want to present information on my form over and above the standard enabled, disabled, visible, not visible. Now, an embedded section control like these here at the very top, I mean, they're still useful, but because they have no visual representation on the form, I can really only show them and hide them. So I can make them visible or not. I don't have that, that ability by clicking the header to expand and collapse it. The trouble with making something visible or not visible is that if it's not visible, when you set a control to, visibility, visible equals false, then that control, its value and everything else about it, it simply doesn't get transmitted to the form page. It's as if it doesn't exist. The HTML for it just doesn't get written. Which is why, by the way, that we can disable a section and enable a form control in that section, and it'll work just fine. The form will open, all the controls in that section will be disabled, except for the one control we decided to set as enabled. That'll work just fine. We have a conflict between the enabling settings, and the lowest level wins. Visibility doesn't work that way. If I say something is not visible, I just don't transmit it to the form at all. So you can't make a section hidden and then make one of its constituent form fields visible, because it doesn't work that way. Because if you make the section invisible, none of it gets written to the HTML page of the form that gets displayed in the browser. So that constituent field that you've said, I want to be visible, well, sorry, it's not going to be, because you've made the parent control invisible. And so it literally doesn't exist on the form. And so your visibility setting for the constituent control is utterly irrelevant. So the ability to collapse and expand a form without affecting the actual existence of those controls, because they still exist. They're just in a section that you are hiding. And that is different than setting a control to be hidden on the form, because all of this data actually exists on the form that's in here. All you're doing is just collapsing it to condense the size of the form on the screen, which is often quite useful. We're going to come back here and do some other stuff there in a little bit, if we have time. I think we will. The button area control. All your forms should have a button area. If you don't have a button area control on the form, Process Director is going to stick one on automatically. But you have no control over where it goes, and it will go on the very, 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 very bottom of the form. We don't usually want it there because, while we do want a routing slip control on our form, in most cases, What we don't want to do is to force a user to scroll through the routing slip just to complete their task. And if we don't put a, a button area control on there, then Process Director automatically sticks a button area control on the very, very bottom of the form. If we're going to have a routing slip on the form, which we usually do, then we do not want to force users to scroll through it, especially if you have a lot of approval activities. And some routing slips can get pretty long, and it's super tedious to be forced to scroll through the entire routing slip. So have a button area control on the form, and always put the routing slip below the button area control, so that once the user's finished reading the form, if they want to complete their task, they can complete their task. If they want to review the entirety of the routing slip, let's make that optional, not mandatory. And I'm just reminded of one more thing that I forgot to mention when we were talking about the timeline. So once again, let me scroll it back in time. Very briefly, I just want you to notice the last activity in this process timeline is result notification. I see a lot of process timelines from a lot of customers, and their very last activity is they always throw in an end process activity. There we go. Now my process is over. That is completely unnecessary. The only time you need an end process activity is whenever you are trying to end the process in some other place than its normal life cycle. With this configuration right here, process time, just as parent activities automatically end when the last child activity completes, process timelines always end when their last running activity completes. So when result notification runs, and result notification is going to be the very last activity for every single process timeline instance that is going to get run for this activity. When it's done, when that notification gets sent, the process timeline ends. It gets marked as complete. You are done. You do not need to throw an end process activity as the very last activity on every process timeline. You are literally wasting your time. You are saying, don't end the activity automatically, end the activity because I say so. And you're accomplishing pretty much nothing. So don't stick the end process activity at the end of your process timelines. Completely unnecessary. Where it is necessary is where I want to end my process timeline at some other point than at the end of its natural life cycle. So some certain event occurs, or I have something on the form. There's some certain data on the form that gets selected, which if it's selected, I want to end the timeline activity. I want to end the timeline. Then that's where you would put your end process. The end process is one of the most used and yet least needed timeline activity types in Process Director. Okay, so now I think I've covered all of the basics of the form, timeline, and email template. So now let's talk about what we should be doing whenever we are creating forms. So we're about to start creating our first form field. It's 11:39, so we're going to get right into just one thing, and then we're probably going to have to stop because we're going to run out of time. So we need our first field on the form. You're obviously going to want to configure your form. Oh, wait a second. There are questions. So maybe we're not going to get into building forms. Okay. So question one. These appear to be duplicates. Oh, because you asked at 10:45 and I missed it. Sorry about that. So anonymous attendee asks, I have some form controls, text field, that are disabled until some specific action happens by the user, which then enables those fields. Would it still be okay to have the option show disabled fields as text? I don't believe I understand from the explanation you've provided what the question is. Because if they're disabled, they're still appearing on the form. They're just appearing as non-fillable fields. If you set them as disabled fields as text and they have no values in them, they'll just be blank areas on the form. I don't think that there is a canonical answer for what you should do in that case, although I would fall down, given that this is a more questionable scenario, I still think I would fall down on the show disabled fields as text. If they can't fill them out, why are you taunting them by showing them form fields that they're not allowed to touch? And using up the resources. Now, look, the resources for one or two form fields are negligible, so we don't really care about resource usage at that level. But again, just ask yourself the question, is there a reason, and there may be, but is there a reason for showing my user a form field that I'm not going to allow them to edit? I think the answer in most cases is no, but depending on your specific implementation, that may vary. I can tell you what sort of general best practices you want to look at. I can't tell you this is what you need to do for this field in this implementation. I just can't really get into that level of specifics without actually looking at your application and having a greater understanding of what you're trying to do. So I think for this series of webinars, what we're really looking at are sort of the normative things that we would look for you to do, with the understanding that just because we say something is best practice doesn't make it like magical or perfect. It just in general is the best way to do things. Every best practice has an exception. Every implementation that you do, you may, for either design purposes or for aesthetic purposes, or because your users like something better, you may break that best practices mold. These are not straitjackets that we're trying to put you into saying you must do it this way and we will point at you and laugh if you do it differently. We're just saying this is based on our experience and the experience of our customers. This is what we have found to be the best way in most implementations to do things. But again, just remember, these are recommendations. I'm not your supervisor. So you can, if you feel it necessary, do things differently. One of the nice things about the platform is that you are not constrained by the rules of convention that entrap the squares, man. You can be free and you can do whatever you want or whatever you think you need to do for either design or aesthetic reasons or for technical reasons or simply because it makes sense to you or because your users would prefer it that way. I'm not trying to bind you up in rules, just trying to give you some guidance on the best way to do some things. Another question. The fields are disabled because they pull data from a database. If the information does not exist, then the user checks a box which enables the user key relevant. Okay. Again, now we're getting into questions about a specific implementation. So I'm going to decline to answer that question. I don't feel that I have enough background, and this probably isn't the best forum in which to pursue your particular implementation. So let's go ahead and keep it centered on sort of best practices here. If you have specific questions and you'd like some advice, you can certainly submit a technical support ticket. We can have an implementer look at and review your implementation. In general, for questions like that, we'll take an agnostic view, however. If you'd like to engage in a DA session and have an implementer look at things, that would be perfectly fine. I think we're generally going to be hesitant, especially in a forum like this, to get into any specific details of your implementation and your scenario. That would be better handled in a one-on-one environment. So let's begin making some controls. So how are we going to put our controls on the page? Now, for those of you who are, sheer HTML professionals, you're obviously your answer is going to be, well, we should use div tags. And yeah, that's great. You're a developer. If you want to use div tags, you certainly can. Hey, we have responsive layout. Div tag yourself to death. But for most people, it's just going to be easier to use tables to do some formatting. And I know in real HTML, you don't want to use tables for layout, but we're going to do it. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a table of 3 rows and 2 columns. And that will enable me to sort of configure where I'd like my various form fields to go. So we're going to use tables as a quick and dirty layout method inside the section to determine where we want our controls to go. Now we have to make our controls. And actually, this is where we need to start thinking about accessibility. What I really need are, for every data entry control, I need a label control. So label controls are required for accessibility purposes. So I know you often see me whenever I'm building things on the fly because I'm building them so slowly, or because I'm building them manually. A lot of times I'll just throw in the text as a label. I'll just type it in manually, but that's not really the best practice. The best practice is for the text labels to actually be label controls. So the first thing we're going to need is a label control, and we're just going to call it request type label to give it a logical name. And then we're going to give it the text that we want to display, request type, and I always like having a little colon there. And then we have to associate it with a control. Now, we haven't made the control yet, but I know what I'm going to call it because I called this field request type label. I'm going to call my actual data entry field request type. And so that is going to be the name of the control that I associate with this label. So I'm done with the label, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit Shift and Enter to enter a new line without entering a paragraph mark. So I'm going to enter a new line, and now I am going to add a control. Now in this case, it's going to be a drop-down control. It's going to be my request type control, and it is going to open up a can of worms, which we'll have to get to next week because it's 11:48. But I'm going to throw my control on here, and I'm going to call it request type. Now, because this control is named request type, and because this label is associated with the request type control, I now have an accessible compliant label and control combination. So when it shows up, if I click on request type, it automatically selects the drop-down control, which doesn't have any values in it or anything yet. Well, we'll have to worry about that later. So what this also enables is if I'm way over there and I notice that just by putting my mouse over the label, it changes the color of my drop-down control. So I am very certain that this label, which if I select it, will select my drop-down control, this label is now associated with this drop-down control. The other thing we have to keep in mind is that when people use assistive devices, if I'm going to use table as a layout, which we already decided was the quickest and dirtiest way of doing it, that's fine. But now we need to ensure that our label and our control that is associated with that label are both shown in the same table cell. So a lot of times you'll see people trying to do something like this, or at least I've seen it. Where we have a customer that will say, okay, well, I'm going to put my label here and my control over there. And that looks fine. It looks like it works. And in fact, if we run the form again, it does work. So if I hover over request type, if I hover over the label, you can see it changes it shows me that I'm rolling over my control. And if I click on request type, it actually clicks it, which is fine for me because I'm using a regular browser. And so it works. If you're using an assistive device, this is worse than being stabbed, because assistive devices expect the controls to be sort of physically co-located with the label, especially if you're using table cells. If the control is in a separate table cell from the label, it makes assistive devices go all wonky, and you don't want that. And your user certainly doesn't want that. So what we're going to do, and I guess I can't control Z back out of it, so we are going to come back over here and, well, need to hit Shift Enter. And we're going to drop that in right there. And maybe we don't even need it on a separate line now that I'm thinking about it. Maybe it'll be just fine to, okay, well, can you go back to a single line? Okay. It really wants to be difficult, and that's fine. Be difficult. Okay, come on, get rid of that. There we go. We'll just put it right there. We'll have it on a single line. We're going to have something bigger over here, which we're probably going to have to get to next week. Fine, I've got my first control on here, my drop-down control. I should say this, whenever you have a table control here and I start throwing things into this section, you're going to notice, and this is just an artifact of how CKEditor works, it's going to want to make this first column as wide as possible, and it's going to try to compress this second column more than I want it. That's fine. We can fix that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to highlight these two cells, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to cell and cell properties. And I am going to set the width, because I have both cells selected. It will select both cells. And I'm going to set the width of both to 50%. And because I've done it on the very top row, all of the other rows have to follow suit with the width, because I'm really setting my column width on this top row. And so now I've got sort of a 50-50 column size in my table. I never have to worry about it again. I can add controls without worrying about my table columns collapsing and expanding inadvertently. And it does that because it wants to give you as much space as possible to put stuff into the column, but it can be a little irritating. So you can short circuit that just by highlighting the items in your top column. And if you have different, and by the way, you can have different column widths. Just remember, if you're going to do it by percentages, they all have to add up to 100% so that it fills the screen properly. So it's 11:54. So we're going to stop here, because we're now about to get into a whole can of worms about best practices around drop-down controls, and we just don't have time to do it. So this is where we're going to take a stop for episode 1 of Advanced Design Concepts. So next week, we're going to start with that drop-down control, and we're going to start building it out. We're also going to add some other controls. We're going to add a section, assuming we have the time. We're going to add a new section to that form. We're going to talk about making those two sections visible at different points in the process life cycle. And hopefully next week we'll finish up the form completely, and we can begin moving to the process timeline the week after that. With that, though, we're done. Have a great week, and we'll look forward to talking to you again next week. Until then, so long.